Hey, what's up guys, it's Oakley, and I just finished watching CA's stream of the Skaven roster reveal. Most of these units we've seen a little bit of in the previews, but there are also some new ones embedded in here, as well as some that seem to be missing. But in any case, let's get into it. Let's start off with kind of the general overview of the Skaven army. So they talked about kind of the Skaven army mechanics. So for a lot of other people, there are special things that are tied to how your health of your army is doing, or different things like that. So for instance, the High Elves have bracing benefits as long as they're strong in number. The Dark Elves have bonuses to killing, the more deaths they inflict in the battlefield. So there's different things like that that trigger a change in how your army reacts. For the Skaven, it's tied to your health of the entire army. So as long as your swarm is in good standing with high health and still a lot of numbers, you have this strength in numbers that gets triggered. And that means you have pretty decent stats, your morale is still standing strong, and I think you get a little bit of buffs to your across-the-board stats. But anyways, that's kind of it. But the second you start to go to low health for your army, a second state triggers, and this is going to be the scurry away state. And this is essentially where all of a sudden the individual clan rat is looking left and right and seeing fewer and fewer of his rats next to him. And this is going to trigger kind of a terrible morale state. And it's actually, interestingly enough, going to buff up the speed of your unit. So they're going to crack much more easily. And when they do so, they're going to scurry away at a much higher speed than would otherwise be usual. So that's an interesting mechanic where, yeah, maybe you can crack a Skaven army pretty quick, but they'll scurry away and be actually pretty hard to catch, and so a lot of them may survive the battle. So that was kind of an interesting mechanic there. So that's kind of the overview of the army itself. And then they get into the different lords and heroes. So the two legendary lords that they announced that we kind of already knew, one is Lord Skrolk, the second is Queek Headtaker, and the duality is, well, Lord Skrolk here is going to be representing Clan Pestilence, and he is a caster lord with the plague magic. Queek Headtaker is going to be on the side of Clan Moors, I believe, and he is a melee character with the duelist trait. So those are your two different lords with different start positions. Or sorry, legendary lords. Next we go into the two lord characters. So you have a Grey Seer and a Warlord. So the Grey Seer is going to be essentially your caster, and he can be given this Screaming Bell mount. And it has two different versions. One that's kind of a buffing version that helps with the leadership and perhaps abilities of nearby Skaven forces. And then the other one is a debuffing version that does health drain against opponents, I believe. And they're saying either the bounce or a bound spell. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but anyways, that's something that will do damage to the enemy, but it has a chance to miscast and I believe hurt your own guys. And then the Warlord is going to be just your kind of, as opposed to a casting lord, he's going to be your melee lord. And this guy actually has an interesting mount. He can be put on what's called Bone Breaker, which is a rat ogre. So that's pretty sweet. And then into the heroes, we have three different classes. First is going to be the Assassin. So this guy functions very much like you'd expect him on the campaign map, where he has lots of bonuses to being able to infiltrate settlements, do conniving things, and kill other people. And I presume within the policies of Skaven, have a good way to influence Skaven politics by killing low loyalty lords and things of that nature. In battle, he's actually going to be pretty good. He has a Concealment Bomb, which allows you to have kind of the highest stealth in the entire game, and that is something where you pop this bomb and all of a sudden you become stealthed right up until 30 to 40 meters, they said, which is when he finally gets revealed. So you can really sneak around, and he has this ability that's called Skaven Brew. He can give it to himself or others, and essentially what it does is it gives you more attack but takes away your defense. So you can imagine popping a bomb to sneak up on someone, popping the Skaven Brew for high attack, and really sniping a key unit before you get on out of there. So that was an interesting character. The next one is going to be the Warlock Engineer. So in battle, he is equipped with a Doom Rocket. So that's something that you saw me use in some of the gameplay before. It's basically a rocket strapped to his back that he can shoot up, and then in the air it shatters into smaller little bits and comes crashing down on the enemy. Pretty good against infantry. This guy here has a halberd and spells, and he amplifies nearby explosions. So that was pretty sweet. The final one is going to be the Plague Priest. So he's a caster with a sensor, and essentially this is cool. It's caster, and the sensor gives him armor-piercing ability. So he himself maybe doesn't have that great health, but he can deal pretty competently against enemy armor. It kind of reminds me of one of the Vermin guys who has anti-armor and can cast spells, but the Plague Priest is just not as strong as one of those Vermin. He can also be given a Plague Furnace mount, and this has an aura of damage as well as pestilence casting, apparently. So those are your legendary lords, and your heroes. Next, they talk about the melee infantry. So first, they talk about the Skaven slaves. These are going to be the largest unit size, they say, in the entire game. Very, very big. Didn't quite put a number on it, but presumably maybe in the 200s range. Huge units. And apparently very cheap, but very low stats, and you can hire them endlessly. So perhaps very low recruitment pools, like maybe they don't take that much food for upkeep. But anyways, you're supposed to kind of swarm them. And they do have different alternate versions, so you can get the base Skaven slave version, or you can equip them with spears, or you can give them slings. And Sia was saying there's pretty interesting mechanics for these guys. Well, yeah, one, they're kind of sandbags, but if you give, the largest unit in the game a bunch of spears, they can at least tie down and ward off cavalry. Yeah, they'll probably get swarmed, but it's enough to perhaps soak up a cavalry charge and deal a little bit of damage. More interestingly, they said when it comes to that slinger, you imagine you give the largest unit size in the game slings, and that means a lot of incoming projectiles that can go downrange and do a lot of damage. So if you pair this up with other units, or you just get a huge mass of these slingers up in the front lines, they can unleash on key enemy units and really pummel them. So that's kind of cool. Next level up is going to be the clan rats. These are kind of going to be your bread and butter. These are large unit size, but not as large as the slaves. They are comparable to Empire swordsmen. Pound for pound, they're not as good, but because they're a larger size than the swordsmen, at the end of the day, they kind of trade evenly. These guys can be given various different upgrades. So one is going to be the shield, one is going to be the spear, and one is going to be shield and spear. So that's that. Next level up is going to be the Storm Vermin. These are going to be your more elite versions. They are similarly larger unit size than a typical Empire force. They're armored and they have good leadership, but they are pretty expensive. There's two upgrades for them. One, you can equip them with halberds, and the other one is you can give them shields, and the shielded version is a little bit more elite as well, I believe, with more stats kind of across the board. Finally, there's two more units, the Plague Monks, and these guys are anti-infantry units, a little bit of a smaller unit size, I believe. They're meant to be offensive. They have a frenzy ability, pretty good leadership, and they're dual wielding, so they're anti-infantry. So those guys are useful when the enemy is throwing Forsaken at you. Plague Monks can probably deal with them better than a mass of sandbags. Next, you have Plague Monks with the Censer Bearers, kind of similar to the Plague Monks. They're frenzied, but these guys here have their Censer, which is this big flail essentially that deals armor-piercing damage and then also lowers leadership. Lastly, CA has a very interesting melee infantry unit that they introduced called the Death Runner. It's not necessarily an official unit. It's something they worked with Games Workshop on to dredge up little bits of the lore to make this unit possible, but it is a fascinating unit. So essentially what it is it's a fast and stealthy unit that acts as a force multiplier. So it moves around the battlefield. It has that same concealment bomb that allows you to have extreme stealth. And so what are you going to be doing with this stealth? Well, their blades have magical attacks that are armor sundering, but to the extreme. They said in the stream that this thing can half the armor of anything it touches. They explicitly said that, hey, if you take on a steam tank, it'll half its armor. If you take on a Stegodon, it'll half its armor. So this thing is going to be a slayer of large and elite armored units. CA had mentioned that because it's fast and stealthy, you can sneak it into combat, swipe a couple blows at some big armored unit, and then get out of there, and while that effect is still in place, get your masses of Skaven slaves with their slings to just start crunching through that, or other units to start dealing death. So this is going to be a very interesting unit. So yeah, I love the synergy you can get with this. Next, they talk about missile infantry. So you have the Night Runners. These guys come in a basic variant or with slings. The basic variant here has swords. They're decent in melee. And what's interesting, they're Vanguard and fast deployed, but what's most interesting is they have these throwing stars, which are kind of short range projectiles, and they can throw these while in motion. So because these guys are fast and they're Vanguarded, you can put them out front of your army and slowly retreat them back, all the while throwing stars. So kind of the similar way you would do with the High Elves, where you put your archers up front and you slowly pull them back. These guys can do a similar role. If you give them slings, they will not be able to fire while moving, but they get the slings that are extreme range, and they're going to be probably an upgrade to the Skaven Slave with slings. Next level up is going to be the Gutter Runners. These are essentially upgraded Night Runners. They have the stock ability. They also have the throwing stars. And what's interesting as well is they get an added ability, which is called Snare Net. and this is basically a pretty big speed debuff that can hit the enemy. And so what CA was saying is the synergy on these guys is really interesting. So there's a couple different variants of the Gutter Runner. One you can get poison, one you can get slings, and then you can get a poison plus sling. But the interesting thing is if you get anything with poison, it slows down the enemy. So that also applies to throwing stars. So what CA was saying is you can send these guys ahead, you engage cavalry, the throwing star that you hit the cavalry with will slow them down because of the poison. And then on top of that, the snare net will further reduce the speed of the pursuing cavalry. So CA was saying that Demigryph Knights sent after these guys, if properly debuffed, will never be able to catch them and can essentially be killed. So that is a very, very powerful unit. If you have the time and space to micro these guys around, if you save them till the late game, they're going to be frightfully dangerous to deal with. Probably going to want to send a flying unit after them or something, or maybe even snipe at them from a distance. Next, they're going to talk about the Warpfire Thrower. These guys are basically flamethrowers, but they're throwing warp. That does, they said, I think it was both fire and magical damage. The damage also lowers leadership. It is not armor piercing, which is key, but it does have explosive damage, so that'll be good against unarmored infantry. Then you have the Poisoned Wind Globadiers. These guys are very small unit size, so susceptible to incoming fire or spells. They're close range, but you know, all that aside, if you do get them up close, they have really cool abilities, which is the fact that they're throwing these little poison bombs, and these can seep through armor, so they're armor piercing and bonus versus large. That is very powerful. And there's an upgraded version called the Death Globe Bombardiers. Basically just an upgraded version that has more explosive damage and essentially more damage in general. They said these guys are going to be your chosen killers. They can really wipe out or do a lot of damage to enemy elites, especially if they're trying to armor up. And so these guys will have obvious synergy with cheap slaves who can sandbag the enemy, and then you just toss in bombs and essentially nuke everything and trade out beneficially. So that's it for the missile infantry that they announced. A little bit conspicuous in their absence are going to be the Giselles, as well as the Rattling Guns. I was surprised to not hear those, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if CA unveils those down the road. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see. And then finally, they round this off with the monsters and equipment. So first, they talk about the Rat Ogres, talking about how these function like shock cavalry, very quick, good charge, but not necessarily the best in sustained melee. Then they talk about some of the equipment, so the Plague Claw Catapult, long range but relatively low accuracy. It can tear up unshielded infantry, and it can reduce leadership. So against enemy Skaven, it's going to be doing great wonders, and in the early game of the campaign, it'll be pretty good against low-tier forces. You also have the Warp Lightning Cannon, anti-large, long range, high accuracy. The Doom Wheel, which we've seen before, anti-infantry. It's a fast chariot that can run over low mass units very easily, and it also has these kind of cannon attacks that when you do a drive-by it'll shoot, so you can actually kind of circle around enemy infantry, shooting all the while, pestering them, and then finally when they're weakened, come in for the charge and break them. So interesting synergy. And then finally they mentioned the Hell Pit Abomination. We've already covered that guy. Very powerful unit. I believe it has anti-large, armor piercing, can tear up infantry, and when it dies, it has this ability where it's too horrible to die, where either it will resurrect with more health or slightly more health, or it will die and then spawn a unit of Skaven out from under it. So that was pretty interesting. That's it for this coverage of the units. Like I said, that is new stuff from what we've seen before, but doesn't quite seem to cover anything. But that's it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned for more, and see you in the next one. Peace out.